All right, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. We are going to be talking about ModScript, AppScript, and JavaScript today. So it's going to be an all scripting session. So why do we need scripting inside SBM? Well, there's certain things that we've built into the product to do a vast majority of the use cases that we find with our customers. However, there's always those specific things that you want to address certain ways, and maybe some functionality we've introduced isn't exactly 100% what you need. It gets you 90 but not 100. And so we introduced scripting way back with AppScript, and as the products evolved, we've migrated into JavaScript and now ModScript. So we try to provide the flexibility in the platform to do everything you can without scripting, but if you need to take it to the next level, you also have those capabilities as well. So first, let's talk about client versus server. So when we're talking about scripting, there's different places that these scripts run. For example, JavaScript is primarily a client-based scripting language. So JavaScript is primarily run on the end user's browser. That is the engine that's driving it. So if I write a JavaScript that goes and makes a RESTful web service call to another third-party engine or what have you, the request and everything is actually being generated from that user's browser. And so depending on the PC that the browser is running on and the different resources available and how you've designed that JavaScript, there can be performance impacts to the application because it's trying to process this big, huge JavaScript and performing these functions. Now, most browsers, especially the modern browsers, have learned to deal with JavaScript very effectively and efficiently, and so you don't even notice that these JavaScripts are executing in the background. Most websites today have JavaScript embedded in them, and SBM has a lot of JavaScript as part of the forms just by itself. It's a core piece of the kind of the internet triad. And then we talk about the server side. Well, the server side, that's where ModScript and AppScript come into play. And so that is when the server is actually making or processing that data. So when you are generating a ModScript or an AppScript and that is executing, you're not actually going to necessarily be seeing the effect from the client side. It's going to be using up the server CPU cycles to actually to perform those actions that you've defined. Now, the very cool thing that we've introduced with ModScript specifically is the ability to write JavaScript that actually executes that ModScript on the server. And so we're just making a simple web service call. So there are ways to trigger that interaction beyond the firewall, but definitely they execute in their own specific areas. So what is JavaScript? It's a major component of the web. There's a concept in web design of the internet triad, which consists of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It was created by Brendan Eich. He's still one of the more foremost web developers in the industry. And like I said, it executes in browser on the client. There are some server-side JavaScript engines, but for our purposes today, all of JavaScript is executing in SBM on the client. And then you can also import libraries that have been created using JavaScript to solve specific things, like jQuery, for example, provides you a lot of ability to go out and perform modifications to the UI that's being presented, as well as performing certain calculations and making web service calls, etc., very easily. And then we also provide the SBM JavaScript API. And so when that JavaScript is executing, there are SBM-specific functions that you can utilize to actually go out and perform certain actions specifically for SBM.
Hey, Matt. Sorry to interrupt real quick. People are getting some static and stuff on your mic. So maybe get a little closer to your mouth a little bit or speak up just a hair.
All right, how about this? Is this better at all?
It sounds a little bit better. Thanks.
All right, yep. So the SBM specific JavaScript API is specific, again, to SBM, and its documentation is in the SBM JavaScript library guide. That is publicly available to you on help.serena.com, and I've given a link at the end of the presentation directly to that. But some of the functions that are in that API allow you to easily manipulate the field values as well as getting those values from certain fields. You can show and hide fields, different sections on the form, manipulate the labels and the colors of behind those labels, and then also call those RESTful web services, especially if you're using the REST endpoints that you've defined inside Composer, and generate some error messages. So how can we use JavaScript in SBM? Well, you can modify the UI. So for example, if I wanted to create kind of a fading effect for some of my different elements on the screen, I could use jQuery that's built into SBM to actually perform some of these actions. And I can also import the third-party libraries or newer versions of jQuery if I want to go ahead and do fading of elements or any other sort of modification. JavaScript also can do event-driven behavior changing. So if you want to validate a value on a form, you can trigger a pop-up if it doesn't meet the specific criteria. Now, you can do some of that within form actions, but if you use JavaScript, it's even more, you're more free to do what you will with that. Then you can also do client-side integrations like zip code lookups from USPS, which is actually one of the things that we're going to be looking at today. Is if I want to just click a button after I enter a zip code, automatically pull back the city and state that's associated with that zip code. So what is ModScript? ModScript is the next generation of scripting engine that we've introduced into SBM, and it's based off ChaiScript. And ChaiScript was it's a C++ based scripting engine that was inspired by ECMAScript, which is the basis for JavaScript. So if you know JavaScript or C++, you're going to be very familiar with the syntax and how ChaiScript actually interacts with SBM. ModScript will do server-side execution, and it's also contextually aware. So depending on when you're executing this, it's very similar to AppScript in this way, that at certain points or certain contexts, so transitions, direct access, or other contexts have very specific things that your different properties and different actions that you can take. And those are all outlined in the documentation. So how can we use ModScript? We can perform our server-side integrations and processing of data utilizing the server's CPU cycles instead of the client, so performance might be a little bit better. We can also utilize external DLLs with ModScript. So if you need to do a very advanced integration to a third-party system, you can take those DLLs and write your own or use an existing, and then implement that as part of the functions that your ModScript is calling. Those workflow enforced actions and events is very similar to the way AppScript works, to where at a certain point in my workflow, I perform a transition action to invoke a ModScript and perform those certain actions. You can use ModScript to work directly at the SBM database level, or potentially even integrate with a third-party database. It allows you to perform external command line commands and then use the data coming back from those command line commands, or even execute third-party applications if there's a command line interface for those. And something new that doesn't exist in AppScript today, but exists in ModScript, is actually be able to generate dynamic HTML and insert that into a form, or insert that into maybe a transition form dynamically, or even just create a raw HTML document if you're accessing that ModScript directly. So what about AppScript? What's the story with AppScript? Well, AppScript is based on VBScript 4.0. It has less functionality. It was introduced back in the 2000s, and it's now in maintenance mode, which basically means no new functionality. We're still doing bug fixes, things of that nature, but we're not going to be introducing new functionality directly into AppScript. It's primarily going to go into the ModScript engine. And there is a conversion utility available to allow you to take your current app scripts and migrate those into the ModScript language. So far, it's a pretty good success rate. There might still be some specific modifications depending on the different actions you're taking in the app script that you have to perform that we can't migrate over. The migration tool hasn't allowed you to migrate over, but for the most part, the goal is the AppScript conversion will work seamlessly for you, and everything behaves exactly as you would expect. So what are some of the core differences between ModScript and AppScript? So ModScript introduces native JSON support functions. So if I need to convert a string of characters to JSON or pull some data from a JSON stream, you have native functions to do that. I don't have to be writing an AppScript to actually perform those actions. I also have support now for defining classes directly in the script. And so you can now work with those classes as objects. And it lends itself more to the traditional programming mindset. We support vectors, maps, lambdas, and function pointers. We have exception handling built directly into the ModScript engine. Function overloading, so that's where you have one function and different parameter signatures. So they perform the same thing, but maybe act a little bit differently depending on what you pass into that function. We also support multi-line commenting now and strongly typed variables. The strongly typed variables, that means that if I define a variable that is supposed to be holding an integer, for the life of that variable, it will always have an integer. AppScript, you could change an integer into a string, into a Boolean, into a etc. So if you need that functionality to be able to switch between the different types, there is a generic variant type that you can use that would hold whatever data you put into that variant object, but best programming practices, strongly typed variables is definitely what I personally prefer. We also introduced several new functions for SBM objects. Inside of the scripting languages, we have SBM-specific objects that we expose, and one of those new sets of functions is transition support. So before, with AppScript, if I wanted to create a new primary item, I would just be able to add it to the table. I wouldn't be able to perform a submit transition. And now we actually do support directly submitting that item through several different functions, and you'll see some of that today. So what are we going to go through today? What different scenarios are we going to have? So first, we've got a JavaScript that the user is going to be inputting a zip code, triggering the automatic lookup of the appropriate city and state, and we'll go through the JavaScript line by line. And then ModScript, we have a certain point in the workflow that we're going to grab all of the tasks and then putting it into a separate SBM application. So let's hop over to my demo system. And Brent, while I'm doing that, do we have any questions?
Actually, we did have one that came in, and it was around the specific types of languages being used. Why is it different languages being used and not existing languages?
So actually, JavaScript is a programming language itself. It is a C++ scripting engine, and so it is not something that we directly maintain. There are SBM specific objects that are being exposed to it, but it is an open source scripting language that is able to be used in many other places. It's been around, I believe, since the 2010 timeframe. So we're not really reinventing anything. We're just using a existing scripting language. The reason that we call it ModScript, our implementation of it, is mainly because we've taken it and we've added SBM specific things to it to be able to work within our abstraction layers within the database and add SBM specific functions. But the core of the functionality is that JavaScript. And so what you'll find in our documentation is primarily the SBM specific things to work within our application, but you'll be able to go to the JavaScript and utilize most of the functions, if not all of them, that are defined in the JavaScript documentation. And that's all outlined, and we even make that recommendation to go take a look at the JavaScript website within the ModScript documentation.
Thanks for that clarification, Matt. I think everybody got a better understanding of the different types of script languages.
Good, good. Yeah, and if we have any other questions about that, please, by all means, ask them. All right, so let's go ahead and submit a new item, and we'll see from a user perspective how this is working. We'll start with the JavaScript, and then we'll pop over into Composer and see the actual JavaScript and how we laid it out. So we'll click on New here, and we're going to submit a new primary item. And we'll give it a title. And we're going to use a zip code. We'll just use the old zip code from where I used to live, 61615. And we'll click on this button, Generate City and State. And you'll see that all of these values then change to Peoria, Illinois. And that's where I was born and raised and still live in that area. So that's the extent of the JavaScript. And then from there, basically what happened is we didn't perform an aux table lookup. There's no data within the system. We're actually going out and using a third-party API to go search based off of that zip code and get back the city and state for that zip code. If there was other data that came in that response, we would be able to expose it here on the form as well. So we'll go ahead and finish the submit, and we'll pop over into Composer. So all of this, because JavaScript is part of the visual design or the form-based actions that are happening, that is all defined in visual design. And you'll see that per application, we have an independent JavaScript section. So this is where if you wanted to take some third-party JavaScript and there was actually a .js file that that was pre-built for you or that you've coded outside of the SBM application, you can import that into the JavaScript section just by right-clicking here and saying Add New JavaScript, and then browsing for the source file here, or you can write your own directly within the editor here. And then this JavaScript file could be utilized throughout many of your different forms. Instead, what I've done, we'll go ahead and delete this, is directly on the form itself, I used a form action. So on the form itself, if I go down here to Actions, I've got one form action here that I just called Find City and State Values. And if I double click, I developed this to say when the button is clicked, then execute this JavaScript. And so if we open up the editor here, we'll make it a little bit wider. Basically what we're doing in the JavaScript is we're grabbing the zip code. So we're using the SBM JavaScript API to get the field value of zip code because it's an SBM field. This allows me to put in the database name of the field or the visual name of the field, the label of the field, and pull back that data. And then this is where I would define the default value. So if I wanted to say if nobody had put any data into the zip code field and I had this published, then it would plug in and use the word default as part of this RESTful web service call that it's making. Obviously, that would not work because default is not a zip code. But if there was a default value that you wanted to always provide, and if it could not get a current value out of this field, that would be how you would do it. And then for this API, we have a client key that we have to specify and pass as part of this API. And so we construct the URL. So the URL for this web service code is https://zipcodeapi.com. And then we concatenate the client key into this string, and we concatenate the zip code as part of the string as well. And then down here, we're using jQuery, which is built into the SBM forms, especially the modern forms. And this capability has gone back to several versions to allow you to perform an AJAX call. And that AJAX is how you interact with RESTful web services in jQuery. And so some of the parameters here are the URL that you have to provide. And so we're just putting in the URL variable here. We have to specify what sort of data type that we want to pass along, which again, since we're not passing data for the get, then there's nothing that JSON's just the default that we pass. And then here's where we define what happens if it's a successful web service call. So on success, we've got this function that we're passing in, and we're storing the response back, which is actually the textual response, the response code, and then we also have an XHR object that we could use to process some of that data coming back from the system. And so what we're doing here is we're logging in the console that it was success, and we're logging the response code, well, the response details from this web service call. Now, the console is a concept within the browser itself. So every browser, when you go into the F12 debugging tools, there is actually a console section, and you're able to see any of the rights to the console to see these debugging messages. And I can show you that here if we go back to SBM. So now there's two different sets of fields. So you might have noticed that we had city and state where I defined the field as either an HTML control, And so if this is something that you just want to show directly on the screen, but you don't want to store it as part of the SBM item, you can do that just by creating these HTML controls. But if you do want to store the results in the SBM, in an SBM field as part of your data design, then you could use our SBM API set field value to find that field and then plug in the response from that web service call. So this response object that we get back has two different pieces to it, one being city and one being state. And so here we're basically using jQuery lookup to say put the response for the city and state inside the appropriate ID of the HTML element, city value and state value, and then we're finding the SBM fields, city and physical state. The reason it says physical state is because state is used for the workflow state, and so it's a reserved keyword within the application. So that outlines what happens when there's a success, but if there's an error, all we're going to do is log the response that we get back to the console. You could also use that section to build in error handling to perform different actions as part of that error and just handle it differently if you so chose. So let me go show you guys how I did the HTML controls. So keep in mind, we're looking for city value as an ID for an HTML control. So this city value right here is just a textual element. And so basically all I did is grab this text right here and I gave it a name. And that creates a HTML, basically a div element that I can provide the name, and that will render as the class, and it will find the appropriate text. The display text doesn't matter because when we say that we're putting in the HTML, we're actually going to overwrite this display text within the SBM form designer. So that's how we just put on some HTML textual values. And then we'll go ahead and show the console debugger as well. So if we go back and submit a new item to look for console debug, we'll hit F12, and you can see it opens up at the bottom of my screen here. And there's a tab here called console. So we've got a message here already. But if we type in, we'll do 07 this time, it's another zip code, and hit generate, it's going to say success, and it just returns an object. And so if I wanted to go into the debugger, I'd be able to actually see that object that's being returned and pull in and see what different elements are part of that object. One thing that I also find helpful when we're doing these different network communications and integrations is actually looking at the network, because I can see the actual message being sent out to the destination system. So here you can see we performed a GET message to the zip code API. And I can see what sort of certificates were passed if it's an HTTPS connection. But then I can also go here to headers, and I can see the different headers that were sent, the request headers as well as the response headers of the message. I can see the raw response that came back. So this is all the JSON that came back. So actually there's latitude, longitude, city and state. It returns the zip code itself. It also returns what time zone it's in, different acceptable city names for this area. And then I can also look at the direct payload and see the raw JSON text that's coming back down here at the very bottom. So this is different in every browser. I'm using Firefox, the latest version of Firefox just released, I think, yesterday. But all browsers will have this sort of debugging capability. It just might be in different places on the screen. So with that, any questions about JavaScript? Have they come in? Any questions come in, Brent?
No, nothing specific come in right now.
Okay. All right. Well, let's go ahead and move on to the ModScript part of the demo. But if there are questions about JavaScript, please feel free to send them in and we'll address those at the end of the session. So let's go ahead and hit OK. We'll submit this item. And so now we're going to just click on this Generate Tasks button. Now you'll see that we've populated the child tasks with 2 new items, 29 and 30. And these were created by a ModScript. So if we go and click on these items, you'll see that they were submitted, and we actually performed the submit transition. And there's actually a change history as part of this where we grab the submit date and everything. Now that's different than what would happen if we used AppScript, because we would just be creating the object in the table. We wouldn't actually be performing the transition itself. And that was always one of the issues with AppScript is depending on what you were doing, there might not be, it could potentially be a way of making modifications without directly showing and telling the end user exactly what was happening. So now if you've got certain transitions and you want to enforce required fields, all of that is supported within ModScript. So let's go take a look at that ModScript that we had to write for this. So you could easily do that through Orchestrations. And that's, I guess, the other thing is, depending on where you're more comfortable, a lot of the functionality that I can do within, that I might use Orchestrations for can be done in ModScript and vice versa. There are some specific things that ModScript can do that Orchestrations cannot, but there's definitely a lot of functionality that can be shared. But if you're more comfortable with the scripting language, then obviously you might want to use ModScript versus Orchestrations. Performance is also a concern because scripting is very quick to execute. One of our script engines, when we rewrote ModScript, we made sure that AppScript and ModScript were very fast, and that we did not lose speed because of the migration over to the Chai script engine. Orchestrations have some overhead to them because we're using web services to interact with those different areas. And there's a higher payload that goes with using web services. So depending on what you're doing, if you're processing large chunks of data, the ModScript engine might be a better choice to process that than using the orchestration engine. So if we go look at our workflow design, you'll see we have a transition here called Generate Tasks. We made a quick transition because I didn't want to fill out any form or anything like that on this item. But then we defined a script action to run this Generate Tasks ModScript. And then, so if we look at the rule description, we've got a run a script before the transition occurs. And all of these options are, you can choose when these occur. And then if the form is invalid for any reason, you can define what to do with the script if you want to rerun or run the script afterwards. So we'll go ahead and say finish. And ModScripts and AppScripts in general are in the extension section of Composer. So if we click on extensions and we go to generate tasks, you can see that we've got our editor up here. and we can go through what this script is doing. So first, what we need to do is we need to grab all of the template items out of this auxiliary table. So real quick, if we hop over to data design, you'll see that I've got an aux table that all I'm doing is creating items that have title, description, and active and inactive on them. By default, they are all active, but I could easily add a where clause to this saying only give me the active items or only give me inactive items. I could also do that for any other type of field here. And so what we do is we create this app record list, which basically gives me a list of all the items that exist in that table. And then we get the table ID by using an SBM specific function called table ID, where we pass in the system table name that we want to query. And so this will bring back the TSID of this table and then populate that into this web service call, or sorry, into this function call. Now that we've created this object, we need to load the items from the database table into the object itself. And so we use the read method as part of this object that got created, this app record list object. We use the read method, and that's when the actual data is pulled. So effectively here, we're creating a container for all the items that are in this table, and read is what actually primes that object with the data. Here, because of the formatting that we have within the SBM table, we just have a variable to start listing out all the different tasks that we've created, their TSIDs, and we started off with a comma because the internal values, we're working at the database level, remember, the internal values of all these identifiers is the TSID, and it's basically a list of the TSIDs for a multi-relational field. So if the read method call was successful and we successfully primed that object, then go ahead and begin processing that object. So the way this works is if that read method returns anything but 0, it was successful. If it returns 0, then it did not. It was not a successful read. And so first we wanted to log some messages. So this again is an SBM specific function that we've introduced into ModScript, and this is also one that is in AppScript as well, the log info message. So all of these messages get sent off to the event viewer. If we refresh here, you'll see we've got some different informational messages. So here we found 2 records. So 2 records were found inside that auxiliary table when we performed the read. So this allows you to actually create a way of creating some logging in the event viewer. Now, with ModScript, we introduced a native ability to log directly to a text file. And so that would be a log object. So now what we do is we say for every entry inside the task to create list, we need to go through and do these actions. So here we create, and again, we're creating kind of a blank object, a placeholder for these items. And we're going to create a project-based record. And we're going to submit it into this table. So we find the sample tasks table ID, and then we set the field value for this. So we know that we want to set the field value of title, and whatever entry, whatever current item that we are processing from this list of tasks to create, we're going to get the field value of title from that object. We do the same thing for description. So we're copying the title and description out of the object that is being processed, and we're going to set the blank object here, because it's new, to that value. And then what we do is we say if, and then we perform a quick submit. And so here we're defining what project we're actually going to submit this to. If this is successful, then we want to create a log info message and say item was successfully created, and we wanted to log the TSID that was created. And so you'll see after this two records found, we have two instances of TSID 30 and 31 that were created. So at the same time, now we're adding to that task created variable that we started up here with the comma. We're going to take that and we're going to add this item along with this TSID along with the item, or with another comma. So the format in general is going to turn out like this. And so we have leading and trailing commas. All of that is in the documentation how to work with multi-relational fields within a scripting engine. Otherwise, we're going to log an error message in the event viewer that says the item was not submitted because it was the result of this quick submit to project was false. And so now, once we've submitted those items, we need to get the current field value for child tasks. So we go back to our parent item to be able to relate these items. And we go, so that item is shell.item, and that is the context in which this script is being run. It's the original item that kicked off the script. So we grab the field value of the field child tasks, and we're going to log the informational message again to tell us in the log file what the current value is. And then we're going to say if the current child tasks is comma, comma, which means it has no value whatsoever, then we just want to replace that value with the brand new set of tasks. So we just set the field value of child tasks to whatever value we've generated with tasks created. Otherwise, we want to take that value, take the existing value that we have, and we want to then add the task created to that value. And so then by virtue of that, we're adding those appropriate values, and that is being saved as part of the primary items transition because this was executed pre-transition. So if we go back to the workflow design and we look at this task or this action here, and we open it up, we're running this script, these actions, we're running this script before the transition actually occurs on the item. So there's an entire workflow of an item transition, and which is all documented, that actually goes through and says, if we're running this before the transition, here's what happens. Here's the order in which things occur. And so because we're setting these values before the transition occurs, we're saving the values in those changes because then the transition finishes. Now, if we were running this after the transition occurs, then obviously any modifications to that item would not necessarily be saved unless we performed an update after that, an update transition after that. So you need to make sure you pay attention to this value depending on what actions the script is taking to make sure that the script is being executed at the appropriate time during the execution of the transition. And then if we pop back to the script, at the end here, we're just saying else. So if this read was not successful, so we did not find any items at all, then we're going to just log an error message that says the read function call was not successful at all. And so, and then the script is completed. So with that, do we have any questions?
We actually do, Matt. We
Awesome.
have a couple here, so bear with me while I read through them to try to sum them down. What version of SBM was ModScript introduced? I know you said that earlier, but I cannot remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, ModScript was introduced in 11.3. So it's the latest, and then we have 11.31, which is the latest version that's available now if you go to support line.
Thanks. One other question could be a little bit of a long one. Can you use ModScript to transition an existing record from another workflow from one intermediate state in a workflow to another state in a workflow?
Yes.
Sort of like a notifications kind of thing.
Yes. So that would be, let me pull up the documentation here real quick. And I'll be able to show you the exact call. So bear with me here. Okay. All right. So here is an example of our documentation. So we're going to take a look. An SBM item generally has a var record associated with it. So it's a var record object. And there's a whole descendant order to all this, or inheritance rather, for all these different objects. But each object has a set of methods to it. And so for a var record object, I can perform a start transition with lock and then also finish transition. So you could easily take the TSID of an item, load that item into a var record object, begin a certain transition, set any values that you need to do, and then call the finish transition where you would finish that transition. The transition would be the transition ID, which would be generally the TSID of that transition. There are other calls that you can make to get what the transition IDs would be as part of that. So you could definitely work with us to help get that identified and help you guys through building that, or professional services would definitely be able to help out with that as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. So I'm going to reread that question since there's been questions about that.
Okay.
What Matt had just shown was how to use ModScript to transition an existing record in a workflow from an intermediate state of another workflow. Is that correct?
Yeah, so basically what we talked about is we have kind of a primary item that when it's executing this script as part of its transition, can it go find a secondary item and migrate that item's and perform a transition on that item? And the answer would be yes. With these start transition and finish transitions, I can go ahead and perform those actions on a secondary item while I'm in the middle of transitioning this first item.
See, that's why I have you. You sound a lot smarter than I do. I'm just a crazy marketing guy. Before we get into more of the questions, are you done with the presentation and we can get to a lot of these questions? Because a lot more keep coming in.
Yep.
So I just wanted to not cut you off, but to keep going on the questions. Another one is around creating an AJAX call, and is it possible to do it on an SBM table?
So let's see. I pulled up the questions myself as well. So when creating an AJAX call, is it also Yeah, so we have a full REST API. So all AJAX is doing is performing RESTful web services calls. So whether you're talking to an external third-party system or you're performing an AJAX call from SBM to SBM, utilizing our REST API, you could easily do that as well. There's no restrictions there, and in fact, that's one of the ways that we have customers that are recreating kind of a line item concept. So if you've got a, say, a purchase request workflow, and you want to add a line item, you can actually click on a button that then submits a new item into a sub workflow as well.
Awesome. You're getting very technical. I'm glad you're reading the questions as well, because some of them are very specific. Another one is around, is it possible to log diagnostics into info from JavaScript, ModScript, to a log that is accessible via a browser?
So generally, JavaScript is isolated to the browser mainly as a security measure. So most of the time, browsers will not allow JavaScript to execute and affect anything on the actual system itself. And so that's why they created that console in the debugger to be able to actually go and debug. I do have another one of my colleagues, one of the developers for this, which would allow, so he's also helping me field some of these questions as well, since he wrote a lot of this. We could use ModScript, and you can invoke ModScript directly from a web service call now. And so what you could do in theory is during your AJAX call or during your JavaScript, make a web service call to the ModScript, passing it along any data. That ModScript could then go onto the file system because it's on the server itself, and then write to a text file. You could also, if you need to be able to view that from the SBM item itself, and you want to build a log into each item, you could definitely take various messages and log that directly to a field inside an SBM item or even an aux table that you have as different items.
Excellent. I hope that answers Paul's question, but if not, I will pass your information over, Paul, to Matt, and let Matt and you get into the weeds a little bit more on that. Sounds like you have a specific technical need, and hopefully Matt got that for you. Another question is, will you be able to call a post transition in ModScript?
That one is a little bit more complex because it's actually pulling it. I'm going to maybe have Don chime in on that one for chat. I have not personally done that one. Yeah, I don't think so, but we can definitely take a look at that in more detail and actually get you an answer. I think that was from Diana. So we can definitely reach out to Diana afterwards and answer that question directly.
Awesome. I think that's the extent of the questions we have right now. I guess you can, it's about the top of the hour, so it's about time to wrap it up and show what we're having next.
All right. So for our next couple sessions, we're going to take a break in February. I've got a lot of travel. I'm one of the solutions architects with Micro Focus Arena, and so we're always out in the field visiting customers like you all, and so February is kind of booked up for me, but our next session is going to be in March, and it's going to be March 13th, where we're looking at the different security and authentication options. We'll be talking about each one of those that have been introduced, such as SAML2, federated authentication within SBM. We're going to be talking about secure headers and how those operate. And so we're going to be sending out an email shortly about registering and getting folks registered for that. You can also go on to the website there, microfocus.com/events/discovering-SBM, and that's where we list out all of our sessions. And so that also contains, and I think this is, yep, there we go. So this is where you can see all of the previous sessions as well, and you can access those and download those for viewing if there are questions or you need clarification from any of those. We're also looking for feedback. So we want to keep these going, and we want to make sure that we're hitting on topics that you all are finding valuable. So if you guys have any comments, concerns, questions, specific things you want to see a webinar on, by all means, please reach out to both myself and Brent, and we'll schedule some more webinars in the future. Obviously, the more people that are interested in a specific topic, that one will probably get done sooner than, but we'll definitely get to all of them over the next coming few months. We want to make sure that these are continuing to be valuable for everybody. So with that, some resources for you. So ModScript transition guide, this is going to be a gold mine for you. It is an excellent document that outlines the differences between AppScript and ModScript, what different capabilities there are between the two, including some of the new functionality within ModScript that's not there in AppScript, so definitely check that one out. For those of you that have written AppScript before, the ModScript reference guide is basically that, only specifically for ModScript. It doesn't go into here's what is new with ModScript versus AppScript. That's what the transition guide is for, but it is awesome guide. We also have the SBM JavaScript API guide. That one is available as well to talk about our JavaScript API that is available on every form and talks about the different SBM specific queries. And then for those of you who just want to learn more about JavaScript in general, there's actually a really good book that I just bought, found it at Barnes & Noble, called the JavaScript and jQuery book. And it starts out very basic, but then it goes into a lot of good technical depths, and they also provide code samples for the different chapters in the book. So I would highly encourage you to take a look at that book if you're just starting out with JavaScript, but you could also look at the code samples, javascriptbook.com/code, and they also have some different generic code samples that you can utilize maybe to give you some different ideas of what you can do. And Paul also mentioned, don't forget the JSON library. So we have a full API guide for our JSON RESTful API. And if you're performing web service calls to SBM, or you want to perform that from a JavaScript, definitely take a look. It's out on help.serena.com. And you're able to see the different web services that we expose out for you to submit new items through REST. And then obviously Serena Central, our support organization, as well as your account team. Please, if you have questions, reach out to us. We want to make sure you guys are successful with the platform. So with that, thank you very much for attending. Brent, do you have anything?
No, just once again, thank you. Definitely there are people who are interested in more and more scripts, so maybe we do another one of these moving forward. But thank you everybody for attending these webinars. You'll probably be seeing an email coming out about the next upcoming one and possibly even a survey to get more ideas of what everybody's looking for in these webinars.
All right, so well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.